Children of the night, what music they make.
You'll never grow old, Michael, and you'll never die, but you must feed.
It's a coffin! A coffin!
It's your coffin, my love. Enjoy it.
Most of us never get to know what it feels like.
Hey, you. Yes, you. Come here. I won't bite. No promises when it comes to what's behind me, though. You see, my dear bug eaters, today we are diving into the sinful, sensual secrets of the vampire. What was it that turned those undead leeches into sparkling seducers over the years?
So the lion fell in love with the lamb.
Is there a reason why they've been adapted so heavily by the romance genre, or are they a monster best left to horror?
I was once a badass vampire, but love and a pesky curse defanged me, and now I'm just a big, fluffy puppy with bad teeth.
Here at Lunar Tales Carnival, our wretched revenants are going to drag you, kicking and screaming if they have to, back to a day where vampires really did rise from the grave to walk among us, so that you can hear the story from their side from the beginning, and so that you, dear gentle viewer, can decide for yourself to offer up your neck or not. No burning up in the sun, no taste for human flesh. Date a vampire yourself for the low, low price of one like, comment, or subscribe. Let's start the show the way I know you all want to, with some real spooks and scares. A real old-fashioned vampire, please welcome Max the Monster. Max? Max, the audience is waiting for you.
No, I've told you fancy hat types before. I am not doing your little monkey dance until I've had my evening blood.
Ugh, I can't even with these fictional character types, so unprofessional. None of us want to be here, people, but we've got a script to follow. The writer didn't create us all for nothing, and you can all be uncreated the minute you stop following orders. Ugh, and of course, I'm the bad guy, because the writer can't cross into the land of fiction. So typical. Hi, Kira Celine. Yeah, that monster character you made is acting, like a monster. Think you can send in some help until it gets back from picking up some breakfast at the nursery? Great, thanks. Dear gentle viewers, you're lucky to be joined tonight by two guests who, well, didn't have anything better to do because they aren't real. Any of us can be summoned at any time, really. Put your hands together for Pip and Sammy. Nice to see you all again. You know, unlike some of the other Debbie Downers around this place, I tend to think that if I'm not performing, I'm not alive. This face was made for the stage, don't you all agree? Of course you do. Now let's get into it. Before Victorian literature brought vampires to the realm of fantasy, there was no shortage of folklore discussing vampire-like creatures. In fact, nearly every ancient culture told of some sort of being that drank blood, which may sound like some pretty convincing evidence that vampires definitely walked the earth with us at least at some point in history. But it actually makes a lot of sense when you consider what blood drinking symbolized to ancient peoples. Now, my specialty is pre-Christian people, and to them, blood drinking symbolized a certain overzealousness when it came to battle. A good example of this would be an Egyptian myth involving the goddess Sekhmet, a warrior goddess who has been strongly associated with healing and with protecting the dead as they transition into the afterlife. In one myth, Sekhmet is tasked with destroying every mortal that betrayed the god Ra. And even after wiping out nearly all of humanity, she still continues to thirst for blood. And so, in an effort to protect the few people who were left, Ra dyed beer red so that she would mistake it for blood and get so drunk that she'd just want to go home and sleep it off, I guess. There's also some evidence to suggest that ancient warlords may have dined on the blood of their victims as some form of intimidation tactic. Or perhaps these were merely rumors that were spread about them to make them sound real big and scary. Everyone's favorite example of this would probably have to be Vlad Tepes III, better known as Vlad the Impaler or Vlad Dracula, a title that he inherited from his father, Vlad Dracul, ruler of Wallachia, which was just south of Transylvania. For the record, Dracula meant dragon, and it more or less referred to his position within the military. And so Dracula would have meant son of the dragon. As a child, Vlad Tepes suffered horrendous torture at the hands of his father's enemies, and watched them steal the throne out from under his family. And so in 1453, he led a battle to reclaim his home. But once he had a taste of power, he went to some pretty extreme lengths to defend it. Anyone who dared question his authority would be impaled. And then he'd just leave them displayed in what I'm picturing to be the most grotesque little forest ever. And it would often take his victims hours or even days to either bleed out or just die from shock or the elements. Tales of Tepes's cruelty even went so far as to allege that he would take his meals out amongst this little forest, and that he would dip his bread in the blood of his victims. Vlad Tepes may not have raised from the grave or burned up in sunlight, but the act of drinking blood alone was considered monstrous to ancient peoples. It's like insult added to injury. Like, we can understand you wanting to reclaim your throne and all, but, the blood drinking, the impaled bodies...
What's going on here?
On the other hand, Christian peoples did not necessarily consider blood drinking to be a strictly vampiric act. In fact, the term vampire didn't even enter into common usage until about the mid-18th century, and it was derived from the Turkish word for witch. Now, as we discussed in our tent on witches, early Christian peoples believed that everything they experienced was the work of either God or the devil, and the act of blood drinking was commonly associated with demons. Even the devil was said to drink blood and eat flesh. Again, the act of rising from the dead is considered an unnatural or magical act that, from a Christian perspective, must be the work of either God or the devil. So in other words, when Jesus rose from the grave, it was okay because God did it. But if anyone else starts doing it, then that must be the work of the devil. Similarly, demons are repelled by Christian imagery and tend to occupy spaces where people feel alone and vulnerable, such as the night. And so it really would not have been rare for a demon of any sort to possess any number of these qualities. Now, that being said, blood-drinking demons were often malicious female spirits, who would prey upon either newborns in a mockery of the nursing act, or upon men in a mockery of some sort of sex act. For instance, the demon Lilith, who in Hebrew mythology was the first woman before Eve, but was cast out of Eden early for wanting to be on top of Adam during intercourse. A woman after my own heart. Was said to be cursed to live on the blood of men and newborns for all eternity.
A woman after my own heart.
Now, all that being said, the idea that somebody could become a vampire of sorts has been recorded as far back as the Spanish Inquisition, when 600 real people were burned at the stake as blood-drinking demons. Now, you may notice that there was a certain similarity between the way that vampires were treated and the way that witches were treated. This is because there's actually a lot less of a difference between the two monsters from an early Christian perspective than you would think. To them, witches were people who had sold their soul to the devil in order to have access to some level of his power, and this usually did leave them physically altered in some way. For instance, in Salem, there emerged this idea that a witch would develop a third nipple in order to nurse their familiar. Well, vampires are also people who have sold their soul to the devil in order to gain access to some level of his power. The only real distinction here is the way in which they were left physically altered.
Alright, that's enough. This is my story. Get out.
Ah yes, Max, the writer wanted me to have a word with you. Apparently the audience is finding you just a little bit irritating.
Oh.
Aye.
Well, I'm Max the Monster. What do they expect?
I don't know, but if you want to avoid being erased, I'd recommend working on your tone. Oh, and you've got a little something. Just there. Hey, you guys. We're cool, right? No need for anyone to get erased or anything. What's that? Oh, yeah, the show. I can get back to that. No problem. So anyway, as that pretentious twit was saying, vampire hunts were actually a thing throughout Europe and the Americas. And similar to witch hunts, these would usually occur during periods of heightened stress and paranoia, especially when it came to vampires in times of disease. For example, historians have suggested that those who were executed as vampires during the Spanish Inquisition may have simply been suffering from porphyria, a blood disorder that is especially prevalent amongst Eastern European royalty and nobility, which can cause sensitivity to sunlight as well as a form of facial disfigurement that can cause your gums to recede, making your teeth resemble fangs. However, Sammy also mentioned that the term vampire didn't really come into common usage until about the mid-18th century, and French Benedictine knight Antoine Augustin Calmet actually played a pretty important role in this, with his 1751 two-volume book entitled The Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and Vampires or Revenants of Hungary, Moravia, etc., in which Calmet claims that Eastern Europe was currently plagued by a type of undead witch that the locals called a vampire. What he may have actually been describing is the Romanian myth of the Strigoi, which is thought of as some sort of blood-drinking witch similar to a Greek siren. The most famous case that Calmet wrote about to support his whole theory of vampires was that of Arnold Paul, a Serbian soldier who had become convinced that he was a vampire and began eating grave dirt and smearing himself with blood to alleviate himself of the curse. Villagers began to blame Paul for the death of multiple people and livestock, which had apparently been drained of blood, which in the case of the livestock was probably just the work of vampire bats. And meanwhile, the people may have been the work of people, but also those suffering from anemia could very easily be mistaken for having no blood upon death. But they decided to dig up old Paul anyway, only to discover that he had barely decomposed at all. And not only that, his nails had grown, and there was fresh blood inside his coffin, which was taken as confirmation of Paul's vampirism. And so, the townspeople drove a stake through Paul's heart, at which point he gave an audible groan and bled out. The bodies of Paul's alleged victims were then similarly staked to make sure that they wouldn't rise from the dead. Now, this story was fantastical enough to start a bit of a vampire craze that Twilight may or may not have been the end of. But these days we do have some pretty convincing explanations for all of it. For one thing, the soil in Eastern Europe is frequently cold and damp, and being buried in such soil would result in a process known as saponification, which would ultimately preserve the corpse longer by covering it in some sort of waxy compound. It would also help the corpse maintain a little bit of flexibility, which was another thing that Calmet noted. As we now know, your skin will also dehydrate and retract from areas such as hair follicles and nails upon death, giving them the appearance of having grown. The blood in the coffin can be explained by many things, perhaps a post-mortem hemorrhage. But also, blood just tends to stay in a liquid form for longer in the colder temperatures of Eastern Europe. And the groan that Calmet claimed to hear Paul give was probably just air escaping his body when he was struck. Even at the time, people were fascinated by the story, but most seemed to take it about as seriously as you might take the idea of Slender Man. You know, it sounds cool and all, but it's obviously fake. In fact, in 1762, French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau was quoted as saying, "If there is in this world a well-attested account, it is that of vampires. Nothing is lacking. Official reports, affidavits of surgeons, of priests, of magistrates. And with all that, who is there who believes in vampires?" But what Rousseau didn't realize at the time was that the 19th century was just about to usher in a pandemic that would make everyone just slightly more paranoid about what their neighbors were doing. Consumption, or as you might know it better, tuberculosis, causes the afflicted person to cough mucus-containing blood, as well as night sweats and weight loss. It's also highly contagious. But if symptoms don't manifest until after the first person has already died, then it may leave the impression that they weren't infected until after the fact. This is essentially what people began to speculate about the Brown family of Exeter, Rhode Island, after 4 members of the family contracted consumption over the course of 2 decades. The townspeople found it odd that so many people of the same family would all develop the same condition. And the theory began to spread that one of the dead family members may have actually been a vampire who would now not leave the Brown family alone. When young Edwin Brown became sick as well, his father George Brown was convinced to dig up the bodies of his family members. And although 2 of the 3 bodies had properly decomposed, 19-year-old Mercy Brown had not, as a result of being stored in a freezing above-ground crypt for 2 months after her death. Mercy Brown's heart and liver were burned, and the ashes were mixed with water to create a potion that was supposed to cure Edwin. But he still died of consumption 2 months later, so really, all they succeeded in doing in forcing him to drink his sister's organs was create an entirely new definition of trauma. Now, the Mercy Brown incident occurred in 1892, and roughly 5 years later, Bram Stoker would release a novel that would make vampires more popular than ever. But that's it for my part.
I followed the script, Fancy Hat. Happy? There's nothing you can do to me now. I'm wiped. Go talk to the dandy.
Dear gentle viewers, please ignore the outbursts from our horrific monster. We just got it shipped in from Transylvania. It isn't quite housebroken yet. But don't you worry, I'll be sure to fix it. And in the meantime, let's turn our attention to the one who invented class. Please try to keep your applause quiet and polite as you welcome Vic the Victorian. Goodness gracious, what an unpleasant fellow. Well, hello there. Let's just get straight to it, shall we? I never was one for dilly-daddle. Now, as much as Bram Stoker certainly popularized and defined the vampire in literature, Dracula was far from the first vampire story, but that being said, the vampire is still a Victorian invention. The time was rife with these sensational stories of supposedly real vampires that only the most susceptible of people believed in. It was the perfect phenomenon to inspire creative types. The first intentionally fictional story to try and build on this figure of the vampire was the 1819 short story, The Vampire. But in order for you to fully appreciate its importance, there are quite a few figures I'm going to need to introduce you to. The most important of them being John Polidori, born in London in 1795. Now, John Polidori dreamed of being a writer, but his father more or less viewed that the same as his son saying that he wanted to be a rock star. So John Polidori's approach at compromise was to become the personal physician for famed poet Lord Byron. Now, in 1816, Lord Byron didn't necessarily have the best of reputations in England, as he had recently divorced his wife and been accused of conducting multiple affairs, including with men and his own half-sister. Needing to escape the scandal, Lord Byron and Polidori traveled to Geneva to join their friends on vacation. Their friends being Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley, and her stepsister Claire Claremont. Now, Mary Shelley was no stranger to scandal herself. She came from a highly intellectual family that supported women's rights, and on top of that, they had recently disowned her for marrying Percy. So she welcomed Lord Byron with open arms, but tensions were very quick to rise within the group. That summer was unseasonably dark and cold due to a recent volcanic eruption in Indonesia, so they were all more or less stuck inside. Quarantined, if you will. Claire was pregnant with Lord Byron's baby, and he hadn't known that she was gonna be there. So he spent the whole time frustrated by her advances. And he seemed to take his frustrations out on Polidori, whom he more or less bullied. Polidori was also extremely intimidated by the talent that he perceived the other writers as possessing. And he developed a crush on Mary Shelley that she did not at all return. So suffice it to say, the whole vacation was pretty damaging to Polidori's self-esteem. One night, they decided to entertain themselves by telling ghost stories. And Byron challenged the group to write their own stories based around the concept of the dead rising. Mary Shelley clearly won the contest by writing Frankenstein, another story based around popular Victorian news, but that's a lunar tale for another day. Meanwhile, Lord Byron started a story, but very quickly handed it off to Polidori to finish. Now, what Polidori wrote was a very brief tale of a young man traveling with a charismatic nobleman, only to discover that this Lord Ruthven is a vampire. And by being forced to keep his secret, the young man winds up losing both his sister and his sanity. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that this story might be a metaphor for Polidori's relationship with Lord Byron, with Lord Byron playing the role of the vampire who seduces Polidori with both his talent and fame. And yet at the same time, he repulses and drains him with his cruelty. There's also a sort of grim foreshadowing in the fact that the vampire ends up winning in the end. As when the story was published in 1819, it was mistakenly published under Lord Byron's more famous name. Lord Byron did do his part to try and prove that the story was entirely Polidori's by publishing the parts that he did write under the title Fragments of a Novel. But by then, the damage was already done, and as far as we can tell, Polidori died by suicide in 1821 at the age of 25, perhaps unable to live with the thought that his best work might be forever attributed to his bully. But although Polidori had his relationship with Lord Byron, the British public had their own similar but different relationship with him. And comparing Lord Byron to a vampire kind of did have an effect on the way that we saw vampires. And that becomes especially obvious in the next story that I'm going to talk about. The 1872 novella Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. For those of you who aren't familiar with the story, it's about a young girl who agrees to house a beautiful noblewoman named Carmilla, whose carriage just so happens to crash next to her house. The two girls begin a potentially sexual relationship that our protagonist seems completely clueless about. But she's simultaneously plagued by nightmares of being attacked by a black cat in her bed. At the end of the story, it's discovered that Carmilla is a vampire, and the big bad men thwart Carmilla in her plan to save our protagonist from a boring life of heterosexuality. Now, there is one thing that you need to understand about the way that Victorians considered sexuality. Homosexuality was not so much an identity as it was a practice. This had the unfortunate side effect of making it seem as though it was something that you could choose to do or not. But at the same time, Carmilla is described in the novel as having relationships with both men and women. But to the Victorians, the former wouldn't have made any difference. If she's sleeping with girls, she's gay. End of story. And by gay, I guess I mean more lustful. Because from a Victorian perspective, any sex that wasn't procreative in nature was bad. It doesn't matter if that sex is homosexual or heterosexual. If it's pleasurable, it's not serving the Lord. I mean, come on, we are talking about the same era where the Queen of England said that only sex workers wear makeup. Carmilla is also extremely revealing in the way that homosexuality was treated differently for women in the Victorian period than it was for men. When it came to men, there were active laws against sodomy to try and deter them. But women didn't have to face the same level of persecution simply because they were considered to be either too stupid or too innocent to ever even think of something like sleeping with another woman. If a woman was suspected of being queer in the Victorian period, then there were a number of buzzwords that were used primarily by men in order to alert other men that that particular woman might just be a threat to the more naive and innocent women around. Carmilla is frequently described throughout the novel as being languid, which, interestingly enough, was actually one of those buzzwords that Victorian men would use to try and trick women, you know? The protagonist's innocence here, well, becoming a trope in vampire fiction at this point, also represents the fact that she's just never been told about homosexuality. She finds Carmilla alluring, but at the same time, everything that she's presenting her with is just so outside her norm that she doesn't know what to do with it. And before she even has a chance to make up her mind for herself, the vampire hunters storm in and stake Carmilla. But we're also left with this understanding at the end of the novella that maybe that desire just might reawaken in our protagonist later on in life. But between Le Fanu and Polidori's contributions, we can already see that the vampire is starting to move into a pretty specific direction. For one thing, both Carmilla and Lord Ruthven are of the nobility class. And in both cases, the drinking of blood becomes a metaphor for nobility's tendency to take advantage of and drain the average person. This is especially clear in the case of Carmilla, who's described as rising at night to feed on the local village girls, simply because they don't matter to her. Carmilla is also very likely inspired by the Countess Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess who was known for dealing outright torturous punishments to her servant girls, having killed somewhere between 80 and 650 peasants, allegedly even bathing in the blood of young girls to retain her youth and beauty. But there's also something else emerging here, which is the figure of the vampire becoming synonymous with queerness. In the case of Lord Ruthven, it was much more implicit, in the sense that he was tied so heavily to Lord Byron. And the sexual scandals of the noble classes have almost always been a talking point. Especially around women, just look at Cleopatra or Marie Antoinette. But between celebrities like Lord Byron and Oscar Wilde, the idea that these sexual scandals could be homosexual in nature was becoming more of a talking point. Carmilla makes more of a direct reference to this than Polydori's The Vampire does, quite literally representing the vampire as an uncaring nobleman who takes advantage on innocent virgins, seduced by the vampire's beauty, and yet at the same time put off by the strange and unknowable world of homosexuality, I guess. And many have speculated over the years that this may have been precisely what drew a young Irish writer named Bram Stoker to the figure of the vampire. Little is known about Stoker's personal life, but those who have tried to study him suggest that he may have been a closeted gay man, due to the fact that his marriage to Oscar Wilde's ex was completely passionless, and he downright idolized writers like Oscar Wilde and Walt Whitman. He even went so far as to send the latter writer a letter on Valentine's Day that reads as follows: "How sweet a thing it is for a strong, healthy man with a woman's eye and a child's wishes to feel that he can speak to a man who can be, if he wishes, father and brother and wife to his soul. I don't think you will laugh, Walt Whitman, nor despise me, but at all events I thank you for all the love and sympathy you have given me in common with my kind. I only hope that we may sometimes meet, and I shall be able perhaps to say what I cannot write." Or a loose translation for modern audiences: "I may be a big, strong man, but you, my good sir, are daddy, and I'd love to have your babies. You seem chill, unlike everyone else in my podunk town. Thanks for leading the Pride Parade last summer, that was cool. Maybe someday we'll meet in person and I'll buy you a drink, winky face." Can you even imagine being Walt Whitman and receiving a letter like that from another famous writer? Man, writers really were the rock stars of the Victorian period. And Dracula is pretty gay, or at least the first part of it is. The weird thing about Dracula, if you've yet to read it, is that it sort of feels like two short stories, both dealing with the character of Dracula. The first half of the novel follows Jonathan Harker, a young Englishman who must leave his fiancée Mina to do business with a Transylvanian count, who he finds odd but alluring. He winds up learning about the Count's vampirism, as well as his more scandalous sexual proclivities, when he meets the Count's 3 wives. And about midway through the book, it seems as though Jonathan Harker has successfully been seduced and devoured by Dracula. However, Dracula then travels to England to confront his new boyfriend's fiancée, at which point Stoker begins drawing heavy influence from the Mercy Brown incident that Max mentioned. Dracula seduces and bites Mina's best friend, Lucy, at which point she becomes extremely ill with symptoms that resemble consumption, fever, night sweats, and weight loss most obviously. Lucy then dies and returns as an extremely horny vampire, who the vampire hunter Van Helsing must destroy. Jonathan Harker returns to marry Mina, and the whole thing just falls into way too much moralizing about the proper roles of men and women for me. Now, remember what I said about how the Victorians would just sort of lump homosexual sex in with any sort of sex that was non-procreative in nature, and all of that was bad. Neither Lucy nor Dracula seem to care all that much about the genders of their sexual partners. They just desire anyone and everyone, and they don't necessarily care who gets hurt in the process. When Dracula is destroyed at the end, everyone goes back to their good Christian marriages, and Bram Stoker goes back back to emotionally cheating on his wife with Walt Whitman, I suppose. But for years, Dracula more or less served as the definitive vampire. The first move-in picture inspired by the novel being Nosferatu in 1922. In all of these early adaptations, Dracula was depicted simply as a monster. It wasn't until maybe the late 60s that we began to see a real change in the depiction of vampires. That's it, Vic. Your time is up. Wait, no, I'm not done! As formative as the golden age of cinema was for cementing vampires as a part of horror culture, we're just gonna skip over all that for now. Plenty of great stories were released, but for the most part, they were just exploitative monster movies, adding little to our dominant understanding of the figure besides fear. But let's jump forward to a time after the Hays Code, when writers were allowed to have a little fun again. Let's have a talk with Star, the sensitive vampire. My story begins in a time long past, in a world that none living today would be able to recognize. The 1960s. In that time, many had already grown weary of us vampires, in the sense that people were just no longer afraid of us as a result of oversaturation and just general stagnation in the genre. I mean, you can only make so many Dracula movies before people start to get bored of it. But at the same time, there was this growing sense of nostalgia within the media for the golden age of Hollywood that many people who were now adults had been raised with. The result was that the majority of monster media being made at the time was...
I'll pour the bat milk.
Oh, outside the surprise!
1966 gave us the soap opera Dark Shadows, which would give us a cheesier, more romantic interpretation of all sorts of monsters. The most popular of them being a sort of Dracula-esque character named Barnabas Collins, who instead of coming to town to confront his boyfriend's wife, is looking for his long-lost love, Josette. A Lucy-like figure who took her own life when she discovered that a life with Barnabas meant becoming a vampire herself. Unlike Dracula in the novel, Barnabas is extremely fixated on the concept of eternal partnership. You know, dating him means not only committing to an eternity together, it also means assuming the identity of his dead ex so that he can just pretend that you've literally always been together. Which is just a level of commitment that I don't think most people are capable of. But it does serve to make Barnabas a more sympathetic character than traditional Dracula was. I mean, both characters are just kind of generally using people with no regard for their feelings, but we do tend to sympathize a little bit more when the motivation is love and partnership as opposed to just sex. Also, when he's only doing it to women, I guess. But Barnabas's tendency to be overbearing and manipulative was also his biggest impediment to finding a relationship, as it's that very vampiric nature to take advantage of people that most women find repulsive, even if there is something sort of sad and lonely about him that draws you in at first. Now, this seemed to be an idea that Dark Shadows creator Dan Curtis was extremely proud of, because when he was brought in to direct the 1974 made-for-TV adaptation of Dracula, he just kinda used the exact same story all over again. This time writing it so that Dracula mistook Lucy for a long-dead love of his, and he intended to turn her into a vampire so that they could be together forever. And future adaptations of Dracula absolutely adored this idea. The 1985 movie Fright Night, which is sort of like a contemporary adaptation of Dracula, has vampire Jerry Dandridge express sexual interest in the protagonist's mom, and he's also living with a man who may or may not be his no-strings-attached boyfriend. But partway through the movie, he mistakes the protagonist's girlfriend for his long-dead lover and becomes obsessed with turning her into a vampire. The 1992 movie adaptation entitled Bram Stoker's Dracula has Mina mistaken for an ex, and the 2014 film Dracula Untold follows a human vampire and his passionate affair with his wife, despite being played by openly gay actor Luke Evans, only for him to become a vampire and then she dies, but then, oop, there she is, reincarnated, I guess. And also her name's Mina for some reason. Honestly, these stories are never clear. They're all just ripping each other off at this point. But this was far from the only development going on in vampire fiction at the time. And while Dracula was getting straighter and more monogamous, Anne Rice was running her own campaign to make vampires queer again. Now, actually talking about the Vampire Chronicles is one of my least favorite things to do. Because I love it, but there's absolutely no consistency to the franchise, so please cut me some slack. I'm trying my best. Okay, so in 1970, Anne Rice's 4-year-old daughter was diagnosed with leukemia, and she passed away 2 years later, something that traumatized Anne Rice so much that she turned to alcohol to cope. In 1973, Rice unearthed a short story that she had begun years prior, about a young man embarking on an interview with a real vampire. With the death of her daughter still so fresh on her mind, Rice set about finishing the story, and in 1976 released it as the novel Interview with the Vampire. It follows the life of a 200-year-old vampire named Louis de Pointe-du-Lac, from the moment he becomes a vampire to about modern-day 1970-something. As a human, Louis became exceptionally depressed after the death of his brother, which interestingly enough, the movie changes it to the death of his wife, which, will be very revealing soon, to the point that he no longer cares whether he lives or dies, which makes him very vulnerable to Lestat de Lioncourt, a vampire who has fallen madly in love with Louis and demands that they spend eternity together. Louis despises being a vampire, mostly because he can't bring himself to hurt anyone, and tries to drink animal blood whenever possible, even though the taste is disgusting. Fearful that Louis might try to leave him, Lestat kidnaps a 5-year-old girl whose parents have died of the plague, and turns her into their vampire daughter. The only problem being that this traps her in a child's body forever, and she eventually comes to resent Lestat for doing that to her. So she kills him. Louis is just sort of indifferent to his boyfriend's death and decides that protecting his daughter is what's most important, as killing a fellow vampire is considered a crime punishable by exposure to sunlight in their community. Louis and Claudia run away together, only for Louis to be seduced by another vampire named Armand, who takes advantage of Louis's feelings towards him to bring Claudia to justice. After that, Louis is just sort of left to wander the world alone, loving and finding purpose in nothing. Now, Interview with a Vampire does play on a number of Victorian vampire conventions in very unexpected ways. Well, for the time, anyway. For one thing, both Louis and Lestat are tied to images of high class, but from a more American perspective. Louis is an American. He was born in Louisiana, and he owns an indigo plantation that owns many slaves, and yes, the fact that the book does not at all demonize that, and instead chooses to depict Louis as one of the good ones who didn't beat his slaves is extremely problematic. Even if you want to argue that it was just a different time and Rice was just writing realistically, nobody really deserves a pat on the back for not beating people. Okay, let's just move on now. Lestat, meanwhile, is a French aristocrat who's been exiled from his land and come to America penniless, but still maintaining the excessive pride of nobility. His arrogance is something that Louis complains about constantly, and we're supposed to understand that that's something that he gets from his privileged background. Anne Rice was also pretty blatant when it came to the queerness of her characters, although she managed to avoid censorship by just making them all asexual. To vampires in her universe, sex just isn't particularly interesting, but the act of biting is explained in such erotic detail that it might as well be sex. And turning someone into a vampire creates such an intimate bond with that person that you might as well just be dating. Louis and Lestat each express romantic interest in both women and men, but the majority of their long-term relationships throughout the series are with men. And while Lestat and Armand still fit in with that stereotype of the queer vampire luring in unsuspecting victims, in the first book anyway, we get a very different interpretation of the queer vampire in Louis, who refuses to kill humans and only seeks relationships with other vampires. Even Lestat is humanized in the sense that he asks for permission before turning people into vampires. It just doesn't occur to his victims the weight of what he's truly asking in the moment. And the book's direct sequel, The Vampire Lestat, clarifies that while Lestat will kill humans, he only ever targets criminals. Now, initially, I think Anne Rice's intention was nothing more than to make some sort of comment on the Victorian tradition around vampires. Just like I'm sure that the angst-driven tone of the first novel is a direct response to a very real and human tragedy. But as she continued to write these characters in sequel after sequel after sequel, fans began to speculate that she may have developed a little bit of a crush on her own characters, and that the main purpose of the series at this point was mostly to serve as girl porn. In this context, we mostly use this term to refer to media that exploits the audience's emotions over their sense of lust. This type of media is usually targeted at a female demographic, and as such tends to feature a cast of attractive men. Homosexuality is accepted, but if there are queer characters, one is usually more feminine than the other to make them an easier entry point for the presumed straight female reader. If there is a female protagonist, she has little to no personality, because her entire purpose in the story is to serve as a means for the reader to fall in love with the hot guy. Now, I think you know where I'm going with this, but before we get there, suffice it to say that there were already many signs that Interview with the Vampire had changed the way that we just viewed vampires, and in works that are much more respected than Twilight as well. For example, the TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which ran from 1997 to 2003, mostly utilizes old folklore when it comes to their vampires, in the sense that they are humans who have been risen from the dead by demons. But we are introduced to two vampires over the course of the series who have managed to retain their human souls. Angel is an obvious analog to Louis, both of them being dark and brooding and opposed to killing humans under any circumstance. Spike, meanwhile, is an obvious analog to Lestat, both of them being more lighthearted and morally grey.
Come on, vampires! Urgh, nasty! Let's annihilate them for justice and for the safety of puppies and Christmas, right?
And there's also that little detail about Lestat becoming a rock star in the sequels, while Spike is styled after Billy Idol. The main difference between the characters is that Spike and Angel are not lovers on the show. They're rivals, competing for the love of protagonist Buffy. Although there is this one little joke that implies that they might have slept together once, so just do with that what you will, I guess. And fans of Buffy had a tendency to declare themselves Team Spike or Team Angel, in a similar fashion to the Team Edward, Team Jacob days of Twilight. The biggest difference in audience reception is that most people considered Buffy to be good, even despite the recent allegations that have come out about the behind the scenes. Twilight, meanwhile, was probably the most blatant example of the vampire selling himself as a girl porn star. But what exactly was Twilight trying to do with the figure of the vampire? Well, let's just say, a lot. We're gonna be talking about Twilight for a little while here, so hopefully you guys have a sense of humor. Okay, so the first thing that we have to mention about Twilight is that author Stephenie Meyer is a Mormon. And being a Mormon, she probably read Interview with the Vampire, and all of the gay stuff just went completely over her head. I think she just saw a story about two hunky guys and thought it would be better if there was a girl involved. Now, I cannot prove that, but I'm gonna give some convincing arguments anyway. Now, pretty much the only reason that Anne Rice wrote her vampires as asexual was to get around censorship. I mean, she already faced a bit of an uphill battle writing gay relationships into her stories at all in the 1970s. Imagine if she had been writing gay sex scenes as well. But regardless, there has remained this certain level of asexuality in the sentimental vampire ever since. For example, in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, one of the major impediments to Buffy and Angel's relationship is that he will lose his soul and become evil if they are ever to sleep with each other, which for the most part keeps them in a constant state of chastity that the show seems to imply makes their love more pure. This approach to eternal partnership without having to worry about premarital sex seemed to greatly appeal to Meyer, and to many people who read the book apparently. Meyer also borrows Rice's concept of some sort of special vampire child, paired with the threat that they may end up stuck in an eternal childhood. But this plot point has a much happier ending within Meyer's more romantic story. But I mean, hey, we already saw how Buffy created this whole concept of a love triangle from Interview with the Vampire, and the entire series is literally just about how Bella cannot choose between brooding vegetarian Edward and the more lighthearted, immature Jacob. Even Meyer's most original concept, the idea of vampires sparkling in sunlight, is meant to refer to the vampire's role as seducer. as Edward explains that apparently vampire biology just assumes that humans work like crows and they'll just follow anything shiny regardless of whether or not it makes sense. And the Cullens may not be nobility, but they are rich, which here isn't meant to be a commentary on anything so much as it's just supposed to make Edward a more ideal match for Bella. Nothing that Meyer wrote into Twilight came out of nowhere. This was all stuff we had already seen in better respected vampire works. It's just that Meyer missed the mark so completely when it came to what originally made these concepts effective that when we saw them all through her eyes, they were starting to look a little ridiculous. And since then, that's how it's been. It seems as though nobody cares about vampires anymore. So, yeah, I'll acknowledge right now, vampires, not the most topical of monsters these days. We haven't gotten a vampire story that really changed the game in years. And in fact, when I was trying to publish my book, I received a lot of backlash from agents just because the book was about vampires. And I was told that post-Twilight just wasn't the right time for a vampire story, you know? But regardless, I still wanted to talk about vampires for my second video because as a queer person myself, I'm pansexual and non-binary. I do find the figure of the vampire to be an extremely intriguing one, and just because the dominant audience hasn't been paying attention, that doesn't mean there hasn't been developments. There are still plenty of vampire stories being released, really good ones too. But in my opinion, I think the most successful ones are the ones that either try to tell a completely new story or the ones that confront the tradition head on. Before we move on though, there are a couple of pre-Twilight vampire stories that I wanted to mention. They're just ones that went a little bit more under the radar, I suppose. The Lost Boys, released in 1987 and directed by openly gay filmmaker Joel Schumacher, features a female vampire seductress who unwillingly lures in protagonist Michael. But once he becomes acquainted with the vampires, he becomes solely fixated on David. Some audiences have also speculated that the movie might be a comment on the obsession around youth and beauty within queer communities, as the main appeal to becoming a vampire is the ability to stay young forever.
You'll never grow old, Michael. And you'll never die. But you must feed.
And 2 years before the first Twilight book was published, John Lindvist released his Swedish vampire story, Let the Right One In, which follows 12-year-old Oscar as he befriends a strange little girl named Ellie, who he eventually discovers is a vampire trapped in the body of a child, surviving over the years by trading her body to maps in exchange for protection. The novel goes on to explain that Ellie was born a boy, but was forcibly turned into both a girl and a vampire by a beyond creepy nobleman. Ellie now adopts a more feminine dress, but rejects gendered pronouns outright, and almost seems to identify as non-binary within the more comfortable space that Oscar creates. Now, the story's representation of queerness as something that's forced upon you is problematic. But more than anything, the story seems to be making a comment on how childhood trauma can cause children to behave almost like monsters. But if given love and understanding, they'll still be alright. End of day, that is what Oscar and Ellie's relationship is about. They know every detail of one another, the good and the bad, and they love each other all the more for it. Despite being a story about children, it truly is one of the most romantic stories on this list. Moving into post-Twilight stories, 2013's Only Lovers Left Alive offers a similarly interesting take to the sentimental vampire, following Tilda Swinton and Tom Hiddleston as vampires who have been married for centuries, but now find their relationship strained by the fact that he's just grown tired of living, while she still has a zest for life. The vampire's eternal lifespan becomes a metaphor for depression in his case. Well, for her, it symbolizes endless opportunities. In that way, the whole movie just sort of becomes a drama about this married couple who happen to be vampires. Okay, so I wasn't entirely sure where to place this one on the list because it was technically based on a pre-Twilight novel, but True Blood didn't really become that big of a hit until the TV show in 2008, and I didn't read any of the books anyway, I'm sorry. True Blood quite literally uses the term that vampires are coming out of the coffin. And the treatment of vampires within the society set up is supposed to be reminiscent of the homophobia that queer people face within more conservative communities. Carmilla, meanwhile, has received quite a few updates over the years. Some of them sexist and homophobic, like 2009's Lesbian Vampire Killers, which is all about how James Corden needs to protect his girlfriend from being seduced by Carmilla so that he can sleep with her.
Next time he'll have me bummed by a big gay werewolf, I swear.
But in 2014, we got an adaptation of Carmilla that seemed to be extremely transformative for the vampire figure. But the thing is, it was a web series, so it only caught the attention of a select audience. The other thing about the Carmilla web series is that it is technically girl porn. It's just made with a queer female audience in mind. And let me tell you, there is definitely a reason why I'm still following Natasha Negovanlis on Instagram. Not to be creepy or anything, but back when I was living in Toronto and was single, I used to fantasize about running into her on the subway, but just wasn't meant to be, I guess. But the reason why this story was so transformative is that being seduced by the vampire was no longer considered a tragic ending. Rather, it represented being true to yourself and your desires. And although relationships of all sorts will come with their struggles, evil mothers, shape-shifting, your meet-cute included kidnapping, none of those things necessarily have to spell the end for you as long as there's still love between you at the end of the day. Moving on, 2019's Bit is another movie that leans heavily into the queer themes around the vampire. By following a group of queer female vampires who hunt and kill men who take advantage of women. Bit also offers its audience an interesting peek into the perspective of Dracula's brides, asking whether or not they were fully consenting to the arrangement. We're supposed to be getting a Vampire Chronicles TV show in the near future, and I guess that we'll see what they do with that. I think the only thing that they've announced so far is the casting of Louis, which I'll put a picture of the actor up on the screen now. But I find it to be an interesting casting, especially considering Louis in the past was a slave owner. So I do find that this casting is a sign that they're going to be playing with the text and doing something. I cannot guess what they're doing, but we'll see how this plays out, and we'll hopefully get something a little bit more modern than the interview with the vampire that we got in the 70s and we got in the 90s, because man, that casting was just evidence that was just girl porn. Like Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, really? Can you get any straighter? Oh, I completely love the movie, by the way. It is absolutely my trash. No judgment. Just... And then there's also my book, Poor Pretty Creature, which is pretty queer. I don't want to dwell on it too long because I really did not intend for this video to come across as an ad. But since we're on the subject anyway, one thing that I will say just about the experience of writing a vampire novel was that it was a much more revealing process than I at all expected it to be when I set out. At the time when I was writing it, I identified as bisexual, and I kind of knew that I was non-binary. I just didn't really know the word at the time to use for it. But that being said, I was far from out and proud at the time. I was more lonely and horny and doing a lot of research on the history of Victorian Gothic. And I guess that I just wanted to express how I felt about these works from a modern queer perspective. But one thing that I found funny about the book personally is that when my partner had read it years later, after I had come out as non-binary, they told me that they could see a lot of implied transgender commentary that I had not at all thought was there when I wrote the book. But looking back, it does really make sense because vampires are just so tied up within this concept of sexuality. And if being non-binary is part of my sexual experience, then of course that's going to work its way into the book. Vampires are a reflection of our unconscious desires, and those desires get revealed simply in the process of writing them. Vampires are a very interesting monster in that sense. But at this point in history, The vampire has just become so fragmented that it's really difficult to say what exactly it represents. But that being said, that is mostly as a result of homophobia and censorship. Like, there was absolutely no reason for these blood-sucking fiends to become associated with queer people in the first place. Polidori was literally just venting about his experience with a bully who just happened to be bi or pansexual. But now we're here, and we should probably do something about it. As I was saying before, the most successful adaptations of a vampire story at this point tend to be the ones that either ignore that vampires were ever associated with queerness, and they just create their own completely new characters. Or, alternatively, you can address it and make all of your vampires just extremely queer. But I have to admit, the weakest vampire adaptations, in my opinion, tend to be the ones that literally just straight wash queer characters ripped off from other vampire literature. Like, how many times are we gonna see Dracula, but straight? Or Louis, but renamed, and now he wants to sleep with you, female reader. It just feels like you're missing the point, you know? A lot of these stories were vaguely written, but that's also just the nature of queer literature in times when you're dealing with a lot of censorship. A Victorian audience would have been able to pick up on the subtle clues and figure out what was going on. But as time went on, and these clues became less culturally relevant, like who is referring to lesbians as languid nowadays, it became just way too easy to pretend that it just wasn't happening. You know, Carmilla isn't gay, they're just gals being pals. And Dracula isn't flirting with Jonathan Harker. He just really wants to penetrate him and exchange bodily fluids. By rewriting these characters as straight, you may not realize it, but you are erasing queer history. And as much as there's absolutely nothing wrong with a vampire being heterosexual in a story, at the same time, there is a long history of queer and women writers arguing for the vampire's perspective that really shouldn't be ignored. It's important. There is a reason why so many people feel compelled to listen to the vampire side of things. Because when the whole world has labeled you as a monster, it's really easy to start seeing yourself as one. We're done here. Take it away, Barker. Thank you so much for your company tonight, gentlefolk. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please make sure to check back in 2 weeks' time for our next tent, all about mermaids. Also make sure to follow Lunar Tales Carnival on TikTok for additional fun facts on vampires. And please, don't forget to check out the Patreon on your way out. Hey, yeah, you, come here. I don't have much time before the writer cuts the video off, so listen fast. We're being held hostage. This world isn't real. I need your help. You need